Once upon a time, in the rolling hills of a quiet rural village surrounded by lush vineyards and sun-kissed orchards, there lived a middle-aged woman named Sophia. She was in her 40s, with a warm smile that hid years of quiet frustration. Sophia owned a small artisanal winery, producing handcrafted wines from grapes she tended herself. Her dream was to expand her label nationally, to see her bottles on shelves in city stores, and her name whispered among wine enthusiasts. But for too long, her efforts had yielded little. Tastings that drew sparse crowds, submissions to distributors that went unanswered, and festivals where her booth was overlooked amid flashier competitors. Each setback felt like a personal defeat, and Sophia often wondered if her passion was destined to remain a hobby rather than a legacy. One crisp harvest morning, as Sophia walked through her vines, pruning leaves with calloused hands, she paused under the shade of an old oak tree. The air was filled with the sweet scent of ripening fruit, but her mind was heavy. Another distributor had just rejected her latest sample shipment, citing market saturation. "Why keep trying?" she whispered to the wind. But then echoes of a lesson from her late aunt, a resilient farmer who turned barren land into thriving fields, resurfaced. Her aunt had lived by a simple principle, the law of averages. "Child," she'd say with a knowing nod, "do enough of anything and a pattern will appear. Wins and losses aren't random forever. Over time, the numbers even out." Sophia sat on a weathered bench, letting the words wash over her like the morning dew. Most people, including herself, wanted success to come quick. They wanted every effort to pay off, every attempt to work, every seed to grow. But life didn't work that way. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes it was no. Sometimes the door opened, sometimes it closed. If you judged your future by one or two attempts like that single rejection, she'd miss the bigger truth. The truth was in the averages. Reflecting on her journey, Sophia recalled her early ventures. When she approached one distributor and they said no, it felt like failure. When she pitched to 10 and 8 declined, discouragement crept in like frost on the grapes. But if 2 accepted and she kept repeating the process, she'd discover the ratio. Maybe it was 1 out of 5, maybe 3 out of 10. But once the pattern appeared, she had something priceless: predictability. Law of averages leveled the field. It meant Sophia didn't have to count on luck or wait for the stars to align. She just had to keep adding to the numbers. Because the law was always working, over time the results would reflect the ratio. That was the principle that could change everything. Once she understood it, she'd stop getting discouraged by rejection. She'd stop taking no as final. She'd stop quitting too soon. Instead, she'd start looking at each attempt as one more step toward the inevitable yes. This principle didn't just apply to business, Sophia realized as she plucked a ripe grape and tasted its tart sweetness. It applied to every part of life: relationships, learning, personal growth. It was all governed by the same law. Read enough books and you'd find the insights that changed your thinking. Meet enough people and you'd find the friendships that lasted a lifetime. Practice enough times and you'd develop the skill. The averages always showed up if you gave them enough chances. So the law of averages told her, your job isn't to control outcomes. Your job is to increase activity. Keep planting, keep trying, keep reaching. Don't measure success by the single attempt. Measure it by the pattern that emerges when you've done it often enough. That's how it would change how she approached her work, her goals, her entire philosophy of success. If the law of averages was true, and Sophia was convinced it was, then the key to making it work was simple: activity. No activity, no averages. She couldn't expect the numbers to balance out if she never got into the game. Every call she made, every conversation she started, every door she knocked on, every seed she planted, it all added to the total. And that meant the more she tried, the more chances she created. The law of averages rewarded activity, not waiting. Sophia remembered chatting with a neighboring farmer at the local market who was downhearted because his crop yields were low. She asked how many varieties he'd experimented with. 3, he sighed, just 3. Now think about it, 3 wasn't a test of the law of averages. 3 wasn't a pattern, that was just dabbling. The law didn't work with dabbling, it worked with volume, with persistence, with repetition. If you played the game enough times, the ratios would show up. 1 in 5, 2 in 10, whatever the number was. It wouldn't reveal itself until you'd put in enough attempts. And once you saw the number, you could start planning your success around it. But the door to that discovery was activity. Like the farmer who plants one seed and it doesn't grow, he doesn't give up on farming. He plants fields full of seeds. Some sprout, some don't. That's the law of averages at work. But only the farmer who plants enough gets to see the harvest. The man who plants one seed and waits has no harvest at all. The same was true in business, in sales, in relationships. The person who makes one call and stops will always be disappointed. The person who keeps dialing, keeps showing up, keeps starting conversations, sooner or later, the law of averages begins to reward her. And here's the beauty of it. The activity itself is what sets the law in motion. Every attempt is a vote for the future. Every effort is a step toward the inevitable yes. Sophia didn't know which attempt would produce it, but she knew that enough attempts would. So, if she wanted the averages on her side, she had to earn it with action. She had to stay in motion. Don't wait for perfect timing. Don't wait for guaranteed success. Just start. The law wouldn't reveal itself until she gave it numbers to work with. Activity was the trigger. The more she tried, the more the law of averages started working in her favor. Inspired, Sophia rolled up her sleeves and dove in. She scheduled more tastings, sent samples to dozens of distributors, and networked at every wine event she could find. At first, the no's flowed like spilled wine, staining her confidence. But she persisted. Once she'd put in enough activity, the law of averages began to reveal its pattern. Maybe it was 1 in 5 who said yes. Maybe 3 in 10 who responded. Whatever the ratio, once it showed itself, she just gained an incredible advantage: predictability. See, most people thought success was guesswork. They thought it was all about chance or luck. But the law of averages removed the mystery. Once Sophia knew the pattern, she could start to plan with confidence. If she knew that 1 out of 5 would say yes, all she had to do was approach 20 distributors and she could expect 4 agreements. That wasn't luck, that was math. This turned effort into a science. It meant she no longer rode the emotional roller coaster of one person's response. A no wasn't the end of the story, it was simply part of the ratio. She didn't stop, she just kept going until the numbers worked themselves out. She recalled her own past pains, like the time she entered a prestigious wine competition and took the loss to heart. Every no felt like a blow to her confidence. But now, seeing it anew, if her ratio was 1 in 10, then every no she heard wasn't rejection, it was progress. Each no was just moving her closer to the next yes. Once she understood that, rejection lost its sting. Instead of dreading it, she started counting it. 10 submissions meant 1 win, and she could predict it with certainty. That's the power of patterns. They let you stop guessing and start working the numbers. When you know the averages, you know the outcome is inevitable. Effort plus time produces results, not just sometimes, but every time you stay consistent. It's like a casino. The house doesn't win every hand. Sometimes players take the pot. But the casino understands the averages, and over time, those averages guarantee their success. They don't have to win every spin or every roll. They just have to let the math play out. That's why the house always wins in the long run. The same principle applied to Sophia's life and business. She didn't have to win every day. She didn't have to succeed in every pitch. She just had to stay active long enough for the law of averages to deliver its promise. Once she saw the pattern, she gained a new kind of confidence. She didn't need to hope anymore, she knew. She didn't need to wonder anymore, she could measure. And that certainty allowed her to keep going without fear. That's how the law of averages made success predictable. But the law of averages was powerful only if she stayed with it long enough. Persistence was what unlocked the payoff. Most people never saw the law reward them, not because the law failed, but because they quit too soon. Here's the truth. Averages only showed up over time. She couldn't test them in a single day or with a handful of attempts. The ratio needed room to breathe. She had to give the numbers enough space to balance out. Think about baseball, Sophia pondered during a village game one afternoon. Even the best hitters in the world struck out. popped up, or got thrown out more times than they got on base. But over a season, their batting average told the real story. 3 hits out of 10 at-bats made you one of the greats, but if that player judged himself by one game, he'd quit. If he judged himself by one strikeout, he'd never step back up to the plate. Success belonged to the player who stuck around long enough for the average to work in his favor. It was the same everywhere. The first week might feel discouraging. The second month might feel slow. But the law was still at work, quietly balancing, quietly revealing the ratio. And if Sophia persisted, she'd see it unfold. She'd watched so many fellow vintners quit just before the numbers swung back their way. They heard too many no's, faced too many setbacks, and walked away, without realizing the yes was just around the corner. That was the tragedy of impatience. The law was ready to reward them, but they gave up too early. Persistence turned rejection into inevitability. Instead of hearing no and thinking failure, persistence let her hear no and think, I'm one step closer. Instead of quitting after 10 tries, persistence said, I'll try 100 if that's what it takes. Because the averages guaranteed the result. And here's something important. Persistence wasn't just about endurance. It was about belief. Belief that the law was real. Belief that effort multiplied by time always produced results. That belief kept her moving when emotions tempted her to stop. The law of averages was like gravity. It didn't stop working just because she was tired. It didn't disappear because she had a rough week. It kept operating. The only question was whether she'd stay in the game long enough to let it pay off. That's the role of persistence. It's the bridge between effort and reward. Now let's talk about how Sophia applied the law of averages in her own life. Knowing the principle was one thing, using it was another. The first step was to track her activity. She didn't just guess, she wrote it down. How many calls did she make? How many conversations did she start? How many times did she attempt? Numbers didn't lie. Once she tracked, she began to see the patterns emerge. Maybe 1 in 5 turned into a yes. Maybe 1 in 7. Whatever the ratio, it was her personal average. And once she knew it, she could plan her success around it. The second step was to stay consistent. The law didn't work for the person who tried hard once in a while. It worked for the person who put in steady effort over time. 10 outreach efforts every day beat 50 once a month. Small, repeated actions activated the averages. Third, she had to accept rejection as part of the math. This is where so many people got it wrong. They heard no and took it personally. They thought it meant they weren't good enough or not cut out for it. But no wasn't a verdict. It was just part of the ratio. If her average was 1 in 10, then 9 no's weren't failures. They were necessary steps to get to the one yes. That perspective changed everything. And finally, stay in motion. The law of averages wasn't for the idle. It didn't reward the thinker, it rewarded the doer. It didn't respond to intentions, it responded to attempts. She couldn't sit in her vineyard waiting for the numbers to balance. She had to give the law something to work with. So here's how it unfolded for Sophia. She tracked her numbers, watched the pattern, accepted the no's, and kept going. If she did, the law of averages guaranteed that success became only a matter of time. That was the beauty of it. She didn't need to be the smartest. She didn't need to be the most talented. She just needed to play long enough with enough activity for the averages to do their job. And if she committed to that, the results would come, inevitably. Years later, as her wines graced tables across the country and her vineyard buzzed with visitors, Sophia stood amid her thriving fields at sunset. The law of averages had transformed her quiet struggles into a bountiful harvest. It wasn't sorcery. It was steadfast action, belief, and the quiet power of persistence. And now she passed it on to others, knowing that in the vines of life, the patient planter always reaped the reward.